as we are going today. If you have questions, please put those in the chat box and we will get to those at the end of the talk. So I am very excited to introduce you all to our speaker today, Dr. John Scrivani. John has a PhD in forest management. He taught forestry at Virginia Tech. He was a research forester for the Virginia Department of Forestry, and he joined the board of Ivy Creek Natural Area in 1998. He served as president in 2000 and 2001, and he is currently our vice president. So let's welcome John and learn all about invasive species today.
Thank you, Susie. Happy to be here. And okay, good. There's no echo now. Great. Yes, thanks for coming out this afternoon or logging into Zoom. Getting ready to talk to you about kind of a long history of biodiversity management at Ivy Creek Natural Area. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation. Okay, looks like you should be able to see that. So the topic is promoting biodiversity at Ivy Creek, fire, deer, and invasive species management. So biodiversity can be defined as the diversity of life in all its forms and at all levels of organization. And that could be at all different scales. So you can talk about biodiversity at the genetic level within a species. You can talk about genetic species diversity within a community, and you can talk about community diversity across the landscape. And you can even talk about it over time. So we're going to focus a lot at Ivy Creek on managing vegetative community biodiversity, just because that is kind of a basis for a lot of other biodiversity. And it's also what we can manage most easily. So why did I subtitle this fire, deer, and invasive species? Well, those are the three main drivers. Oh, hold on a sec. It's not advancing. There we go. They're the current drivers of biodiversity change that, at least in my view and the view of several other people, at Ivy Creek currently. So fire is actually, it's not fire itself, it's the lack of fire that is currently a driver of biodiversity change. And then deer, because of their herbivory, can be a force driving communities in certain directions and preventing regeneration in a lot of species. This buck was, I took this picture yesterday at Ivy Creek right by the barn. And I didn't take this autumn olive on the right yesterday. That's actually snagged that off the web, but that was as a common sight through much of Ivy Creek in the summertime. So the past drivers of biodiversity dynamics, if we go back to the last glacial period and the post-glacial period after that, 20,000 years to 12,500 years before the present, the drivers of change was climate change, extinction of megafauna, and those things resulted in the boreal forest that probably occurred in this area at that time, slowly transitioning to oak, hickory, chestnut kind of forest that we would probably recognize today. Before European contact, from about 12,500 years ago to 400 years before the present, hunting, gathering, agricultural, and human use of fire were major drivers that kept the oak, hickory, chestnut forest in place in a matrix with agricultural clearings, Piedmont prairies, open woodlands, and savannas. Post-European contact from about 400 years ago to today, timbering, species extinctions, agricultural land clearing, livestock grazing, dams, loss of wetlands, invasive species, urbanization, and accelerated climate change have all led to a lot of changes in our landscape. So This actually, some things I took from, these are some items I took from the county's, Albemarle County's Biodiversity Action Plan. And they list some of the species that have been lost in Albemarle since European contact, including bison, Carolina parakeet, passenger pigeon, gray wolf, mountain lion, Carolina parakeet, Henslow sparrows. And then the other things, we can look at the landscape to see how our environment is different than it was before European contact. There's been a lot of forest loss and regrowth, but the current forest is fragmented. It's in smaller pieces than it used to be. There's a lack of large forest blocks. Particularly in the last century or so, in 70, 80 years, there's been a lot of suppression of both natural fire and human-caused fire, and that has led to species changes. There's also been the introduction of invasive species mainly from Asia, but from other countries as well, other continents as well. And then there's been the loss of predators leading to, among other things, larger deer populations. And now, of course, we're in the middle of accelerated climate change. So a lot of these things lead to species loss, the loss of our predators. We're starting to lose key stone species in our forests, particularly among the trees, the chestnut trees and the ash trees. Excuse me, going the wrong way. Okay, so let's look at a more recent and local snapshot of the landscape history at Ivy Creek Natural Area. So we can go back and get a good idea of what the forest was like by looking at the 1937 aerial photograph. And on this map is in the darkest green are the areas that were forested in 1937. And it was about 112 acres of the current 219 acres. And then looking at a 1974 photograph, which is the closest to the beginning of the Ivy Creek Natural Area, the designation of the natural area, we had afforestation going on, old abandoned fields and pastures growing in, and that's then that medium shade of green. And that was about 21 acres added in that period. Since 1974 to 2018, the most recent aerial photograph I was able to find, the lightest green area has reverted to forest. And much of that was during the tenure of Ivy Creek Foundation's management of Ivy Creek. So we went from about the area was about half forested in 1937 to about 84% forested now. So these are positive trends. It reduced the fragmentation and enlarged a forest block. We also converted some old fields to prairie and savanna habitats. And we have some negative trends going on over these since 1978, 79, when Ivy Creek Foundation was established. We've had the spread of invasive species being the primary one. We also have some neutral trends, maybe positive, natural succession from early to later forest stages. So a lot of the early pine stands and other early successional species are starting to die out, and we get maturing, succeeding to more mature forest stands. We also have some primary succession going on the reservoir. It's already occurred. So these little areas up here on off the peninsula, sedimentation in the reservoir, which is its own problem to our community, but it has created these little islands that are now become forested and become vegetative and gone through primary succession to mostly forest stages. So there's been a lot of study of biodiversity over the years at Ivy Creek. I don't know why the picture of this is not showing up, but there is a count of the vascular flora at Ivy Creek that was done in 2010. Excuse me, most recent one was 2010, but it was first done in 1980, revised in 1989, and updated again in 95 and 2010. And then I believe there's been some updates in 2015, addendums. And we have about 679 vascular species. And over the years, we've added, I think, about 26. I'm not sure exactly if that's correct because of species that might have been missed in earlier surveys, but generally, at least the trend is increasing number of vascular species. Also, there's been a good bit of monitoring of the birds at Ivy Creek by amateur birders, and the Piedmont Virginia Bird Club leads a monthly bird walk at Ivy Creek, and those have been recorded, and they set up a hotspot on eBird. And so that current hotspot shows 179 different species have been observed, and with 2,874 checklists that people have submitted to eBird at Ivy Creek. So it's obviously a burning hotspot, and we have a fair measure of the biodiversity of bird species. Also, we have some additional species lists that have been added over the years. We have a list of common mosses and liverworts, butterflies, dragonflies, and damselflies. We have a list on our website of fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. So if you want to, I encourage you to go there to take a look at these lists to get an idea of what our resources are. So working with Virginia Native Plant Society, particularly Mary Lee Epps and Tana Herndon, we've mapped the botanical hotspots on Ivy Creek where there's unique or at least noteworthy occurrences of species or assemblages of species. And we wanted to do this before we started doing much more invasive species management. So we are aware of where we need to be extra careful and where maybe some of our best sources of regeneration of desired species are. We know a lot about Ivy Creek Forest because of the work of Tom Deroff. Tom Deroff was the research forester for the Virginia Department of Forestry, and I had the real privilege and honor to work with him over a number of years when I came to work for the Virginia Department of Forestry. And after he retired, one of the many things he did was actually do a survey of the forest of Ivy Creek, and actually did a very detailed analysis of the land use history and the forest history. And I would encourage you to take a look at this document if you haven't already. It's available on the website. And I'm just going to highlight a few things that he found. He talks about the land use history before the Carr-Greer family stewardship. Before the Civil War. It's really unknown, but it was likely farmed and grazed like most land in Albemarle County, starting around 1750. So it was probably heavily used and maybe abandoned. Some of the land was probably abandoned several times, but there may be some areas that were always remained in forest, but were probably cut. But we don't really know much before the Carr-Greer era. During the Carr-Greer stewardship, Tom was able to deduce a number of things that happened. There was significant timber harvest, both partial harvesting and clear cut harvest. In fact, the barn was built, it's at least reputed to have been built from timber cut right on the Ivy Creek land or the Carr-Greer land, and milled possibly on site. And then there was also evidence of erosion control using Rock Creek dams. So they were trying to obviously manage erosion, and as a county extension agent, obviously he was performing the best practices for the time. The owners following Connolly Greer, cultivation largely ceased or ceased completely. Grazing and timber harvesting continued, and then there was some gradual abandonment of the fields. Ivy Creek Natural Area was established in 1979, so many of the abandoned fields then began succeeding to forest, except for four fields that had been maintained by the foundation by haying at first, and then mowing and fire on occasion later. So some of Tom's observations I thought were noteworthy was that he recognized that the biggest change affecting the forests of Virginia is the huge reduction of forest fire frequency over the past 70 years or so. And what this means is that the diverse mixed species of hardwood forest, particularly oak, hickory, and before the chestnut blight chestnut, are being replaced by less diverse forests composed primarily of the few shade tolerant species that are available. In Ivy Creek, that's primarily beech and red maple. And one of the ways that foresters know this is going on is by looking at what we call advanced regeneration that we can find in a stand. So in a stand of trees, you're looking for seedlings, but not any seedlings. To qualify as advanced generation, they have to be tall enough or have enough stem diameter to be able to colonize the site after there's an opening in the forest or a harvest or partial harvest or a clear cut harvest. And in fact, most advanced regeneration is actually seedlings that have survived for a long time in the understory, have died back or been browsed back and resprout and keep growing and build up root reserves until there is light available to them from an opening or a timber harvest. And then they can grow fast and get into the canopy. Tom also observed that invasive species were having a big impact on the forests of Ivy Creek, particularly invasive plants, Oriental bittersweet, followed by autumn olive, and then Japanese stiltgrass, he felt were the biggest threats. And they seem to be increasing despite heroic efforts by a dedicated group of volunteers. And when I first started volunteering at Ivy Creek, there was already efforts underway to control invasive species. And they've been going on for at least the last 20 or so years. I think they've made an impact, but we still have an invasive species problem. So this year, we engaged the Virginia Forestry and Wildlife Group, a forestry and wildlife professional services group in the area, to do a invasive survey. And their botanists walked through the entire property and recorded the species occurrences and severity of their infestation or their amount of cover that he found in the different stands of the forest. And one thing I forgot to mention that Tom Deeroff, as part of his study, mapped the forest stands. And so foresters like to talk about forest stands, which are areas of forest that we treat as a common area, an area that has roughly the same assemblage of species, roughly the same age or age structure, and that's the kind of it's an operational unit really for looking at forest stands or for managing them. And Tom did an expert job of designating quite a few stands throughout the property, and he had some help from Tex Wheeler with the county GIS department, and they would map these stands, and they created a geodatabase of the stands at Ivy Creek that we are still using today, and are found to be very useful and right on in how he described and assembled these stands. And you can see on this map that they're all kind of light shades of green, but the darker shades of green are the forests that were here in 1937. And then the lighter shades were ones that were abandoned fields and grew back in to forest. And you see that's the concentration of the various invasive species are concentrated in those stands and along the edges, along the right-of-ways, along the utility right-of-ways, and along the edges of the fields. And they found the most prominent invasive species was autumn olive, followed by oriental bittersweet, and then Japanese stiltgrass. But there's a long list of offenders that we have problems with that follow below. So this is a very useful starting point for us to talk about managing our forests for invasive species and our fields. And they did come to a couple conclusions I thought were worth sharing. It's clear that the greatest threats are autumnal, oriental bittersweet, and Japanese stiltgrass. There's multiflora rose, ailanthus, and I might mention ailanthus because that was one that we spent a lot of effort on controlling back in the late 90s and 2000s, possibly before, and I think that's continued until today. And I think that could have been, my subjective feeling is that we'd have a much bigger ailanthus problem than we do now if we hadn't been doing that work over the years. And there's been work done on the autumnal, and we've made some progress on that as well, but it's still a significant problem. The areas of highest intensity of species, as I mentioned, are the abandoned open pastures and cropland areas that are now forest, utility rights-of-ways, and all the edge habits. And these are the sources of seed for these invasive species to invade the more mature forests. So they're threatening these the mature forests, which generally have better ecological integrity. So the conclusions, this is a little long and wordy, but I'll just summarize it. So the folks at Virginia Forestry and Wildlife Group felt that that targeted approaches could be successful, not only protecting and restoring the ecological health of the mature hardwood forest, but aiding the younger forests to reach maturity. The healthy meadow systems provide a diversity to the landscape, but they do create a significant amount of edge habitat, which must be kept clean. But it does provide the diversity of additional habitat types for the public to learn from and to attract different species. It's clear that the older growth, healthy hardwood stands have been able to hold back many of the invasive species that are found in the more disturbed settings. And these are species rich, and they, from an ecological perspective, are the healthiest systems on the property. So we have some real resources both to protect and also some to draw on, because I'll talk in a few minutes about how we want to go about or thinking about going about invasive species management. And one of the important things is to have natural species available that can recolonize the site after you control the invasive species. So I mentioned the lack, the suppression of fire having an impact on our forest composition, moving them away from the more mid-tolerant species like oak and hickory to the more tolerant species like shade-tolerant species like maple and beech. But the large populations of white-tailed deer are also a factor in that because they will browse that advanced regeneration I was talking about. And they may interact with invasives since invasives are not generally the preferred food for deer. And so they could give the invasives an advantage by their differential browse of the more desirable native species. But we don't know that much, we don't know as much about the deer problem at Ivy Creek as we do about the invasive problem. So the first step would really be to see if there's a study of the current deer herd. And kind of my feeling is that they're not primarily the cause of problems of lack of advanced regeneration and other natural species and other native species that we desire, but they may be contributing to it. And if we find with a study of the deer herd that if it's warranted, we might consider population control options. At least I would recommend that we consider that. And this may become more important if the invasives are controlled and the natural regeneration of the desired natural native species is hoped for. So we don't want to get into a position where we are just controlling invasive species and just making better food for the deer and not getting the native species regeneration that we hope for. So this all gets around to really what I am working on primarily is how we can better manage for biodiversity at Ivy Creek. And so we don't have to invent the wheel here. There's a lot of people working on ecological restoration. In fact, there's a society for ecological restoration that has adopted international principles and standards for that practice. So one of the things they recommend right off is that you develop reference models for restoration. So if you're trying to restore a community or an area of a diverse group of communities, you have to know what kind of community you're trying to restore. What is your target? What does that look like? What species are there? How is it structured? How does it operate? And ecological functions does it provide? And then you can identify appropriate restoration actions. Generally these include protecting the site from damage. And in one sense, we have protected the site for quite a few years now from any kind of development, and that will continue in the future. We want to control or mitigate threats. So the threats of invasive species are certainly there among those. We want to prefer natural regeneration. So the preferred method is, when you're talking about controlling invasive species, at least, is to reduce or eliminate the invasive species, but have natural regeneration in place or nearby that can colonize the now open areas. Otherwise, you're likely just to get the invasive species back. And if that is not possible, that if there are not natural regeneration of native species available, you can do assisted regeneration. That could be as simple as planting, sowing seeds, or other methods of introducing species to the ecosystem. And then the worst, not the worst, but the most intensive restoration action would be actual reconstruction. It's starting basically from bare ground and trying to plant all the species or bring in all the species that occur there. But we fortunately do not really face that because we have pretty good set of species to work from. And then you need to plan for ongoing maintenance. And then it's important to monitor, document, evaluate, and report. So before we start invasive species projects, I think it's good practice to get a good assessment of what invasive species are there and their quantity, and also what native species are there and desired species are there and their numbers and their populations. And then document what we do, evaluate, report, and then follow up with measurements of the species that occur after we treat, and hopefully we have a positive impact, increasing the desired native species. So in addition, the Society of Ecological Restoration throws out eight principles underpinning ecological restoration. One is engaging stakeholders, and fortunately we have a good resource of stakeholders with the Virginia Native Plant Society, the Piedmont Bird Club, and just a lot of interested volunteers who bring a lot of knowledge about natural history and native species to Ivy Creek. And we also want to draw on many types of knowledge. So we want the local volunteers and amateur naturalists, but we also want to draw on experts in the field from Nature Conservancy, the Natural Heritage Division of Department of Conservation Resources, and other maybe nonprofit groups that are involved in ecological restoration. Another principle is that you want to be informed by the native reference ecosystems. And although we want to be informed by that, but we're not trying to get it back to some pristine state that we don't know ever existed or what it looked like when it existed. So, well, I'll talk a little bit more about native reference ecosystems, but it's not necessarily going back to pre-settlement times, because things have changed, the environment has changed, and the environment in the future is changing with climate change, accelerated climate change. So we need to pick a native reference ecosystem that is realistic for us. And then the fourth principle is support ecosystem recovery process. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. We want to assess it against clear goals and objectives, and we want to aim for the highest level of recovery possible. And then 7 and 8, we want to have a plan that gains cumulative value, so projects build on each other as we implement them. And then as a part of a continuum of restorative activities, similar type of concept. So, okay. So principle 3, I want to talk about a little bit more. So it requires identifying the native ecosystem to be restored and developing those reference models and communicating that as a shared vision to people involved, our stakeholders and people involved in the restoration effort. So principle 4, ecological restoration supports ecosystem recovery processes. That is based on the idea that the most reliable and cost-effective way to kickstart restoration is to harness the potential of remnant species, plants, animals, microorganisms that are on the site, that are able to regenerate, to colonize and expand from where they're found to the areas that we're controlling invasives on. So where do we get some native reference ecosystems? I think a good first place to look is at the Commonwealth of Virginia's Division of Natural Heritage document that's available online for you to look at, the Natural Communities of Virginia. And we can select for what I propose doing actually is to look at each one of our forest stands and fields and select a native reference ecosystem that describes the approximate condition the site would be in if degradation that had not occurred. If we, for instance, had not had the invasive species, if we had not controlled fire for the last 70 years, if we had not allowed deer populations to get out of hand. It is not necessarily a historic state as it may recognize the inherent capacities of ecosystems to adapt to changing conditions. So I think it needs to be realistic, that it needs to be something that is possible to attain under current conditions and current climate. And these native reference ecosystems that we might choose as targets can be described using reference sites and sites that are environmentally and ecologically similar but have experienced minimal degradation. And that's where Division of Natural Heritage is another resource for us, because they have these reference sites that are published on the web, on their website, and also at the NatureServe website. So for an example, if we want to keep managing the 2 larger fields, the North Field and the South Field, for Piedmont prairie type conditions, we could choose this reference native ecosystem or natural community in Virginia. This is an interesting one. This is actually a picture of the North Field at Ivy Creek. It was restored back in 2000 from a hay field that was had been hayed for a while, had been mowed after for a while after the foundation was established, and it we came through in 2000 and sprayed to kill the fescue. We did a burn to prep the site after the fescue was mostly killed, and then we came through with a no-till drill and sowed what was at that time the recommended levels of Indian grass, little blue stem, and big blue stem. We actually got a very good success, actually probably more of a take of the seed than we expected. So it's a pretty dense stand. Both of the fields have pretty dense stands of these native warm season grasses. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the invasive problems and management problems are in these fields. This is an interesting one to choose because the Piedmont prairies are well documented in historical literature, but they disappeared pretty early after colonial European settlement. So there's not really good native systems that can be described. In fact, it's, these ranks of importance, the H stands for historic, which means they don't have really good reference sites. They do have some reference sites, which are a couple of them are on military bases where there's Fort AP Hill bombing range is one, or tank range, whatever it's called, where there's constant fires, and they've kept a lot of the areas in this Piedmont type of prairie. Another thing they have as a resource for us is the spreadsheets of species compositions from these reference sites. And they list the mean cover and the constancy, if they're how many of the sites they're found on. So all the reference sites, you know, little blue stem and Indian grass and goldenrod and mountain mint are found on 100% of them. I have also gone through these and checked off what we found at what has been found at Ivy Creek in our list of vascular flora. So our site has, you know, some conformance to this Piedmont prairie description. Another one that's actually our rarest one, if we want to, well, the rarest one we have at Ivy Creek is the Piedmont hemlock hardwood forest, and we have a few hardwood trees off of the north field and the stand above there. It is actually an imperiled site. It's not a large area, but it's this is a picture that was taken part of the recent survey by the Virginia Forestry and Wildlife Group. So a lot of the Peninsula Trail is one of our better hardwood stands in terms of native species and overall ecological health. And it probably matches pretty well with a Piedmont mixed oak heath forest. But we haven't done really all the work we need to do yet on this to kind of match up our stand maps with reference native ecosystems. But you know, that's, I think, where we're headed, to pick some of those just as a part of the planning process. It's a guide to how we want to manage our forest and stands. So I could draw a few conclusions about biodiversity management at Ivy Creek Natural Area. So for the past 42 years of management by the foundation, the forest area increased by about 50 acres, representing about a 23% increase. To a large extent, the forest stands that were present back in 1973 have fared better in maintaining natural vegetation and species richness. You know, some of that's natural resilience, but some of that has been the efforts of volunteers at Ivy Creek. But at over the same period, invasive species have expanded, primarily in the old field forest stands, the forest stands that grew up after the old fields were abandoned, and in the open fields. And that despite some significant effort by volunteers, this has happened despite the significant efforts by volunteers, which may have helped stem the tide. There's been a fair amount of work on Atlantis and Albemarle, and I don't have the data to show it, but I think it's fairly obvious that has been marginally successful, at least. And I think my conclusion that the warm seas and grass fields have increased the biodiversity over the hay fields they replaced, but we do have issues of ongoing maintenance and invasive species occurring in the fields, and native hardwood species trying to follow natural succession and colonize the fields. So what is the future for biodiversity management at Ivy Creek Natural Area? Well, what I'd like to help do is develop a plan, and we got a number of people who are working with me on that at Ivy Creek. Excuse me. And what we want to do is follow the best practices of ecological management. We want to select a target natural reference ecosystem for each stand and field. and document the status of current vegetation and invasives. Then develop priorities for invasive control projects and implement those projects, and then monitor and evaluate. Some planning guidelines that I've gleaned from the literature follow. So we want to manage for desired species, not against undesired species. We don't want to just go in there and say, we're going to kill all the Albemarle, we're going to kill all the Ailanthus. While that may be a good benefit, it's not really what we are managing for. We're managed to have desired species replace those undesired species. So it needs to have a plan for natural regeneration, preferably natural regeneration. And any kind of project that's going to succeed is going to be a multi-year plan, maybe a few exceptions. But for the most part, the major species we have that we have to deal with, Albemarle and bittersweet and stiltgrass, they're not species that can be controlled with one treatment in 1 year. And they also are ones that can't be eradicated and never expect them to come back. So we have to have a long-term plan for maintenance to keep them from coming back. And we must measure our progress with data collected before, during, and after each project. And I think we must practice adaptive management because we don't know necessarily what's going to be the most effective way of controlling invasive species in every site, and it may vary across the property. And we might want to evaluate solo control options and actually combine control options in an integrative management plan. And we may even want to conduct some experiments to evaluate side by side what treatments are most effective. And I think as a general principle, we want to work from the least weedy towards the most weedy areas. And that has a couple advantages. It makes the initial control task a little easier, but it's also likely where there's natural native species that can provide natural regeneration nearby, and that may be the quickest way to get those colonized to native species. Exceptions to the above may be that we may want to attack some of the most weedy areas if they are major sources of invasive seed or propagules like rhizomes or roots. So, one example may be, I'm not sure this is the case, but it'd be the upper field, which is, a Acknowledgements thicket, and it's producing lots of berries that the birds are eating and carrying off to many other stands across the area, across the whole Ivy Creek area. So, went through kind of fast. I hope to have lots of time for questions, and I want to acknowledge a number of people that I've worked with over the years, and I was hesitant to come up with this list, particularly the people on the left here, because these are the people I remember working with, and I know there are a lot of other people that worked at other times that I might not have been involved, but I think it's I was impressed just with the list I could come up with off the top of my head, and I'm sure I missed many more people. So it's really, I think, a testament to Ivy Creek Foundation that we've had so many dedicated volunteers over the years, maintaining trails, doing education. But these are people that I remember at least being involved in studying the forest and controlling invasive species and promoting biodiversity. We've had a lot of cooperation from organizations, certainly the Nature Conservancy that helped make Ivy Creek possible to begin with. The Virginia Department of Forestry over years helped with prescribed burns and always kind of supported Ivy Creek. That's actually how I got on the board to begin with. Somebody else had been rotating off the board and said that was my civic duty to join the Ivy Creek Foundation and help them out, and I'm glad that happened. Albemarle County Parks and Recreation and Charlottesville City Parks, do a lot of work. They manage, they're in charge. They're responsible for managing it in cooperation with us. Also, the Albemarle County Natural Heritage Committee and the biodiversity plan that they developed, which I used a lot to come up with some of these ideas and some of the recommendations. Natural Heritage Division of DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, for all the work they've done in natural communities. Wildlife Resources, they were helpful in getting the warm season grass field established. And then the local naturalist organizations, Native Plant Society, the Bird Club, have long used Ivy Creek and been a real resource for managing biodiversity at Ivy Creek. And then Virginia Forestry Wildlife Group for doing the invasive surveys. And I'm sure I'm missing, again, a whole lot of organizations and other people that have been involved in helping manage biodiversity at Ivy Creek. So I do want to just kind of finish up with some of the general references. And these are the things I relied upon. Certainly the natural communities of Virginia a lot, the Albemarle County Biodiversity Action Plan, and then there's international principles for ecological restoration. One thing I did do, oops, wrong way. I did kind of look through Albemarle County's Biodiversity Action Plan to see where we are furthering some of the goals that they laid out. And so we didn't hit every goal, but quite a few. So one very specific goal was promote management of county-owned lands in a manner that conserve and enhance biodiversity. Well, I think we've done that, or hopefully continuing to do that. We've hit goal 5 by reducing habitat fragmentation. Goal 8, manage invasive species. Goal 9, maybe, develop strategies for biodiversity conservation change during climate change. We've helped protect a large forested area. We've helped identify, restore, and protect prairie and savanna habitat. We've improved county stream and river buffers. We've protected some wetlands, and we certainly educate the public on the importance of biodiversity and the ways to protect it in many ways. And I think we're going to help develop, well, I think we already have, and hopefully in the future do more to develop indicators and monitor data that reflects the state of biodiversity in the county. So I recommend you might want to read that book if you're interested, or that document. It's pretty well done, and it's been a good resource for me. So I guess I'll turn it back to Susie or Sue if we want to entertain questions.
Hi, John. So far, you only have one question or two questions in the chat. The first one is, with the threat of the spotted lanternfly, might that move reduction of Atlantis up as a priority?
Yes, I think so. I think so. That's a very good point. And I think Atlantis, I was glad to see in the invasive surveys report, and I know from the folks that volunteer at Ivy Creek a lot, that we have a fairly limited Atlantis population, and that it would be very wise to attack it as a high priority. And that's one I think we can try to, if not eradicate, at least nearly eradicate if we gave it an effort.
Okay. The next question is, how are savanna and prairies? How are savanna and prairie
different in the Piedmont? I guess compared to the Midwest, I guess is maybe the reference there. I'm not sure. I mean, in some ways they're very similar. They were maintained by fire, and they have some overlap in species in the Midwest prairies, but not all the Midwest prairie grass species are here. And then, of course, a lot of the associated herbaceous and species are a little bit different, and that's where those reference communities from natural heritage can be useful. And the trees are typically the trees that are native here anyway, but are fire adapted. So shortleaf pine and some of the oaks that are more fire adapted, and some of the hickories that are more fire adapted.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can you talk briefly about managing meadows at Ivy Creek without the use of herbicides?
Yeah, so I think the one question we need to address is can we manage them effectively with mowing alone, or do we need to include prescribed fire to manage them better, to increase species diversity? And if we have, I guess if we have, if we have a acceptable mix of species in the in these prairies or savannas, then mowing or prescribed fire would be sufficient. There's no need to target individual species. We do have some exotic species though that are occurring inside our fields and our prairies or savanna targets that may be approached with mechanical means, but generally the literature suggests that those are best dealt with limited use of herbicides. So that's something that we've not made any decision on that, but that's, I think, something we probably should consider and test possibly. Can we get effective control without the use of herbicide, or do we need to include that in a limited integrative manner?
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? You can just unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. Okay, well, I would like to thank John today for this informative talk, and I'd like to thank all of you for spending time with us today. We hope that you enjoyed today. We have enjoyed having this talk and having you all with us. I'd like to take a moment and tell you about our next Ivy Talk. It will take place on January 23rd. Tom Wild will discuss efforts to restore the American chestnut in Virginia, setbacks and progress. We're very excited about that talk as well, and we hope that you will join us for that. If you enjoy these talks and you like what the Ivy Creek Foundation does for our community, please consider going to our website and becoming a donor. And otherwise, thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Welcome. Thanks. Happy holidays.
Thank you.